Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography. We are going to continue looking at Southwest Asia today, and in particular, we're going to look at the Arabian Peninsula. And for my students, again, this is continuing in Chapter 18. So let's take a look at what we're going to be able to do today. We're going to be able to identify the physical, the economic, as well as those cultural traits of Saudi Arabia. That's going to be the major focus of our learning today. We're also going to be able to identify the economic and the cultural traits of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, also known as the U.A.E. We're also going to be able to identify the economic traits of Oman and Yemen. We'll just briefly here at the end touch on the conflict in Yemen today. All right, so let's kick things off with Saudi Arabia. So just to give ourselves a general area as far as physical geography, Saudi Arabia finds itself as the largest nation in this area and the largest nation in Southwest Asia as a whole. Find ourselves here between the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Arabian Sea. And certainly these are some of the nations that we will be looking at. All right, Saudi Arabia, like we mentioned, this is the largest country in Southwest Asia. For my U.S. listeners, it's about roughly half the size of the eastern half of the United States. So it's a pretty large nation and certainly one with a lot of wealth. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. It's a pretty dry, arid climate. Certainly desert is going to make up a part of the, or at least the majority of the climate here. And a great example of that would be the Rub al Khali, or the Empty Quarter, which is the largest desert in Saudi Arabia. All right, the Asa Oasis is the largest oasis in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has a couple of major sources of naturally occurring water, oasis or oasi. Not quite sure which one it is. That's why I don't teach English. Is certainly one of those. And water is scarce in Saudi Arabia to begin with. But you'll sometimes also see water come from what are called wadis. And wadis are valleys or ravines, or sometimes a channel, that are dry except in the rainy seasons, which does make its way to Saudi Arabia occasionally. This is an economy that is certainly based in oil. That being said, Saudi Arabia has not fallen into the trap of relying solely on oil. They've certainly diversified their economy, and they know that this is a non-renewable resource, and that someday that oil wealth won't be there. And so they have begun to diversify into other forms of energy as well as other parts of their economy. But that oil does provide a lot of wealth, and that wealth from oil is used to build schools, it's used to build hospitals, roads, certainly airports, and technologically Saudi Arabia is always kind of trying to push some changes. And again, that oil wealth does allow them to do that. They also do spend some money on another source of water, and that is desalination. So they bring in salt water, they remove the salt, and then they use the fresh water remaining, whether it's in irrigation, whether it is for drinking water. It's also important to note that Saudi Arabia, as far as its geopolitical importance, oil is a big part of that, and it certainly, as a member of OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, it does, in many ways, have a lot of sway over the oil market, certainly being one of the largest producing nations of oil. And so that does give them a certain amount of power. They're also an important strategic ally for nations like the U.S. in the Middle East. So looking at the infrastructure, Saudi Arabia has spent a lot of money on building an infrastructure to send that oil and natural gas now too throughout its own country, but you can also see here into other countries in the Middle East. So encourage you to maybe take a moment, pause, kind of look through this and kind of see how it connects the ports that you'll find in the Persian Gulf and certainly even to the Red Sea as well. One thing we do want to note is that Saudi Arabia plays a really important role in the establishment of Islam, but also the spread of Islam throughout world history. And the photo that we're looking at here is of a holy site in the city of Mecca. This is the Great Mosque. Muslims, as part of their faith, will take a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime, and that journey is something called the Hajj. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. We're not going to go into a lot of depth on Islam in this particular video, but I would highly encourage you to go check that out and kind of expand your understanding if you need to. As far as Saudi Arabia itself goes, about 85 to 95% of Saudi Arabia follow the branch of Islam called Sunni, or the followers would be known as Sunni Muslims. The other 10-15% of Muslims follow the Shia faith. This is pretty consistent with what we know about Islam. We know that there was a schism, or a schism, depending on how you want to pronounce it, or a separation that takes place. And a big part of that is the debate over who the next successor to Muhammad was, whether it should be the direct descendants of Ali, who was the son-in-law of your Prophet Muhammad, or if the next leaders of the 4 caliphs that came during the time of the empire building for Islam, or whether they should be. And again, we're not going to go into a lot of depth on that today, but certainly make sure that you, if you're curious about that, or if it's somewhere that you think you want to learn a little bit more, go check it out. When we look at Saudi Arabia's government, we could kind of use 2 terms. The first one we could use would be an Islamic theocracy. And so anytime we have a theocracy, we have religious leaders who have power in the government. And certainly that is a case here. A lot of Islamic law is law in Saudi Arabia. And certainly we could see that being required or as being a part of the political practices of Saudi Arabia. The other one we could use is it's a monarchy, one that is led by the Saudi family. And certainly there is a monarch within that family. And so it's kind of one of those examples that we have in the world today of an absolute monarchy. All right, let's shift gears to the Persian Gulf states. So this is Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the U.A.E., the United Arab Emirates. Oil is a really big driver here. It is the engine that drives the economy of these nations. This is also a region that has pretty high standards of living. And in almost all of these, if not all of them, there's access to free education as well as free healthcare. And that is a big part of the wealth and the what is being used with that wealth. Speaking of interesting things that are used with oil money, here are some examples. So Formula Rossa is the fastest roller coaster in the world, and you'll find all of these in the U.A.E. Certainly they're within a kind of like within a shopping mall is an artificial ski resort that you can go skiing in the U.A.E. You'll also see some of the tallest buildings in the world, including the Burj Dubai, as well as the Burj Khalifa. And you'll also see attempts at the Dubai World Cup and bringing soccer through Maidan. All right, looking at Oman and Yemen next. Oman, largely desert, does have oil, certainly natural gas, copper, and marble as well. You'll also see there's an agricultural industry here, certainly the domestication of camels, and certainly cattle, as well as dates and bananas. And a lot of that would be using, like we've talked about already in this unit a little bit, the drip irrigation in order to cut down on evaporation. You'll see the Strait of Hormuz, which we're going to take a quick look at here, then I'll come right back, is a natural choke point. So connects the Gulf, certainly here, the Persian Gulf, to the Arabian Sea, and it's an important place of trade in the Middle East. Yemen, on the other hand, unlike a lot of the nations in this region, they do not have oil. They do not have a substantial oil reserve, and most of the farming that you'll see is herding using livestock. It's in the ancient world, it's a pretty famous stop for trade routes. However, currently Yemen is dealing with war that includes a lot of nations in the region and also other international powers. It's led to some very challenging times, including getting basic necessities in to help the people of Yemen. Sana'a, Yemen is a walled city, and portions of it are still World Historical Sites or UNESCO sites. So it certainly has some history, definitely, when it comes to this region. As always, check out the check-in quiz. It's kind of a combination of multiple choice this time, along with a little bit of multiple choice, as well as some short answer. As always, use this kind of just as a way to check in to make sure that you're kind of picking up on some of the bigger ideas. For my students, check this out. If you've got questions, please let me know. I'm here to help you. For my listeners, I really appreciate you listening. Like we say here, we hope that in some ways that it's promoting a little bit more geographic literacy in the world and maybe just understanding each other's cultures a little bit better. I want to thank you guys for listening today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.